Chapter 1. Praying for Forgiveness. Aftermath. The Wizard. The snow was stained a violent red, and Theron's boots crunched with each step as the sun began to slowly set behind the mountains on his left. The first dark was almost on them. The soft shadows of the trees and the roots became long like outstretched fingers. In front of him were the remains of the caravan and the aftermath of the battle that had begun to end in the last few minutes. He could smell burning flesh and wood. He could still hear the occasional clang of sword on sword or a cry of pain, a scream for mercy, a call for a mother. "For this black path I tread in your eternal name," he muttered under his breath as he walked. To his left was the looming mountain, spotted with pines that grew tall and stretched into the sky. To his right was the edge of the road that dropped sharply into the valley below, where the trees and rocks spread out like flowers in a field as the shadow of night started to overtake it. Before him and behind him was the long caravan of over a dozen wagons that were all headed for the city of Portus. Wagons of the enemy. He felt a sudden hand around his ankle as he sauntered down the road. He looked down at the face of a young soldier, his silver armor and black beard stained with crimson. Theron gave him a long look and a tilt of his head. He studied the soldier's face. He remembered when he himself looked like him. He remembered being young and ambitious and hungry for glory. This soldier would never have that. "Please," the soldier cried out, leaving a bloody handprint on Theron's trousers as his hand fell to the snow. "Mercy." "I am forgiven," Theron replied coldly, continuing his prayer. He killed the soldier with a dagger to the throat and walked away to the sound of the bubbling and gurgling death that caught in the man's throat. "For the unending empire and broken throne reclaimed," he picked up where he left off. Crunch. 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 He left a trail of his mercy behind him. Around him, the caravan they had attacked was now in flames. His soldiers were moving swiftly along its flanks, wagon to wagon, in search of their target. The mission was almost complete. "I am forgiven." He watched some of his soldiers drag an elderly couple out of one of the caravans. "Please, no, please," the woman cried out in a shrill voice. "Mercy, mercy for my wife," the old man begged. Theron saw both of them die from his peripheral as he headed to the back of the column. "For Queen and Mother, I give myself to enemies' wills," he sighed under his breath, closing his eyes momentarily as he spoke. He looked up at the white sky, now turning dark, as the snow fell softly on his face. He closed his eyes, feeling the tickle of the snowfall. For a moment, he was a young boy in Reine again. "I am forgiven." "For homelands that call to me to rest upon her hills," he spoke aloud once more, following the column. He came to a black wagon that was pocked with dents and slash marks. At the base of the wagon's entry were the crippled bodies of several Reinian soldiers. He tapped his sword on the window and heard some cries from within. This had to be them. "I am forgiven. For the malady I feel in me with every tired breath." He produced a flame in his hand as he approached the wagon door. The door was painted a shiny black that reflected a distorted version of himself back at him. He felt the warmth of the magic spread through his veins. It was intoxicating to feel that power. He was a master of fire. He was a soldier of Reine. "I am forgiven." He reached for the door handle and heard crying from within. "And for every soul I take for you that knows my name is death." He turned the handle and pulled. He never got to the last line of the poem. When he opened the wagon door, what he found inside was a young girl no older than 14 and her younger brother. She was shielding him with her arms, her cloak walling them both off. The boy was no older than 10. She was scared, he could see it, but she was also fierce, with a wild look in her eyes as if challenging Theron to step closer. All of this he gathered in a moment, because the moment the door flew open, she dropped her cloak to reveal a crossbow, and a crossbow bolt pierced him in the chest near the shoulder. Theron had only but a moment to feel the pain before the boy started to scream, a screech unlike any he had ever heard. His eardrums twitched in pain, and in moments, Theron's mind was invaded. He felt a searing pain enter his skull. There was no doubt. The boy was the target. Theron fell to his knees as the blinding pain crippled him. He dropped his dagger and clutched his face as pain overtook him in both body and mind. His vision blurred as he felt the trickle of blood in his armor, and it all went white. He saw himself. No, he saw the boy. He was the boy. He saw glimpses of the young boy's life as if looking through his eyes, orchards and petals falling to the floor, laughing with his sister by the lake, running through lavish halls and getting his first sword. He heard his name called. Kit. Kit Vandren. And his sister was Reya. The visions became a blur. Now they were more recent. He saw Kit crying in the middle of the night, the things in his room floating off the floor. He watched as, in another vision, Kit set a tree on fire by touching it. Theron could see this boy was powerful. Far too powerful for someone so young. In another twisting blur, he watched the boy set off with the caravan. He saw the caravan attacked. He saw his family die. He saw Theron opening the door. Then his vision went white again. But something else came over Theron. He felt a sense of longing and peace as the family set off for the capital. He felt safe until he didn't. And Theron didn't feel the wrath of the gods in the boy like he had been told to believe. He didn't sense danger. He didn't sense evil. But he felt fear. He felt desperation. And right now, all the boy could feel was the urge to flee. Theron screamed and howled in pain. He couldn't see, but he felt the two children push past him out the door. He heard the shouts of his soldiers as the boy got farther and farther away. His vision returned. He was on his hands and knees, gasping for air, staring at the ground that was now covered in his own blood. And the strangest thing of all, he felt tears running down his cheeks and falling into the snow-laden ground. In that moment, only a single thought entered Theron's mind. I am forgiven. What have I done? Chapter 2. Home. The mission. On the road again. Theron felt a sigh of relief when he broke the tree line and crested the hill. His shoulders dropped. The armor he wore weighed on him, but seeing these familiar lands, he felt the weight lift suddenly. He could see the fields and farms extending beyond the horizon like a blanket. He could just make out the silhouettes of the palace and the spire on the horizon, and the walls that called to him. Just above it all was the great celestial body, Alterian, though the Eldari called it Calith. The moon, Oris, was off to its right today, far off in the distance. He was almost home. His horse neighed as if sensing his thoughts. I know, Snow, he spoke softly to her, patting her roughly on the side of her neck. She closed her eyes in response to his touch. We're almost there. With his heels, he spurred Snow down the hill. Theron heard the clinking of armor as the rest of his team followed closely behind, now passing through the forest. They began to chatter amongst themselves, finally letting their guards down after crossing familiar borders. He started to sing a song. The rest of his team picked up on it, and soon all 100 horses were clopping along with the song filling the air. "And we're coming home," he sang loudly. "Home to where the trees grow tall and the willow calls and calls and calls." He heard them all clap in unison once, twice, 3 times. "And we're coming home," he continued softer now. His voice fell out of the chorus, but nobody noticed. Theron and his company passed expansive fields where farmers waved to the company of weary soldiers as they passed. A few of his company waved back. They found themselves near the outskirts of the city by the main gate. The town that had sprung up outside the walls was just as curious of the soldiers, though it was more in hushed voices and stares. They passed the ancient stone walls, walls that had stood for thousands of years long before the country of Alara rose. These were the walls of the firstlings. Though the capital city was now long gone, the bones of the kingdom of Reine were as strong as ever. Passing through the gate, the sun was blocked out by the massive spire that rose from the center of the city, casting a great shadow on Theron. The main street into the city was paved with stone buildings and potted greenery. The cobblestone streets were cracked and old, and the city itself seemed to have learned to live with the earth that was slowly trying to reclaim its place. At the end of the long street was the large, square-like palace, painted in black. With his company, he passed down the street, down the market square, beyond the interior walls of the city, and into the royal district. And he was home. "Welcome home, soldiers of Reine," he heard the officer call out across the throne room. The soldiers remained quiet, as was custom. They all bowed their heads lower. Theron counted the tiles on the floor. He counted the moments until he could go home. He counted the seconds until he could sleep in his own bed once more. "You have done well in service of our great and lasting kingdom," the High Constable spoke. The Queen was not in this room as usual, not that the troops noted her absence. Most assumed she had more important things to do. "The Great Mother has protected you and guided you back home." "We seek forgiveness for our sins," the soldiers called out, still kneeling before the throne, their voices echoing off the marble walls. "You are forgiven," the High Constable spoke. Theron hated their voice. He hated the shrill, nasally nature of this would-be soldier who commanded so much respect and knew nothing of the sacrifices that his company had made. He doubted the High Constable had ever been in battle, let alone ever lifted a sword. The clack, clack, clack of the High Constable's staff echoed as he paced in front of the throne. "We are forgiven," they replied in unison. Theron rose with the others. He watched the hunched shape of the High Constable Malik stare back at them, scrutinizing them. Theron could see he was preparing to speak. "They're sending us out again," he thought to himself, feeling the pit in his stomach grow. He ached to rest, but he put the thought out of mind. A good soldier does what needs doing. "The Queen, in her wisdom, has asked that you, the forgiven of the Black Company, ride out once more," Malik spoke. It was followed by a silence that permeated the halls. Theron could feel the weight of the glances at his back. His soldiers were tired. He was tired. "There is a caravan crossing near the Calanthian Pass. Within this caravan we have received word that not only will there be a long list of nobles of many houses, but among them a tainted soul." There was some murmuring. "The Queen asks that you purge them," the constable finished. "When would you have us ride?" Theron asked, his voice feeling foreign to himself in this room. "At first light," Malik replied. The caravan is already moving, and you must make haste if you are to catch them at the pass. Resistance? Theron asked. They are traveling with an escort of approximately 200 armed Imperial soldiers, however, be prepared for more. 200 troops. Maybe more, all for one mage? Theron asked, raising his eyebrows. This tainted, Malik corrected, is important. We are not sure why, but if they are being guarded so well... Malik paused as he walked up face to Theron, who stared back at him without emotion. All the more reason that they don't arrive in Portis, wouldn't you agree, Captain? Theron nodded and said no more. Make no mistake. The army that travels with them must be crushed. But your priority is the noble families they are protecting, and most of all, the tainted, Theron said softly. The tainted. Malik continued, apparently not having heard Theron or choosing to ignore him. You will see the will of the Great Mother done. In the name of the Queen, he tapped his staff on the ground with a resounding echo. The troops immediately stood at attention and spoke in unison. The Great Mother speaks. The forgiven bleed. Then there was silence once more. Good. Welcome home, forgiven, Malik began. And we cannot wait to welcome you home victorious once more, he finished. Theron didn't know it yet, but he would never again lay eyes on his home. Chapter 3. The Siblings. In the Shadows. Are we there yet? The road was bumpy, and Reya was beginning to feel nauseated from the trip. Her brother, on the other hand, was staring eagerly out at the snow-covered hills that stretched out below them. The road they were on snaked along the mountainside like a great dragon, and the hills fell away steeply beyond it. How far, in fact, was hard to determine, as a fresh layer of snow had covered the land last night, and they awoke to a chill in the air that had already slowed them. Outside, Reya could hear the rhythmic marching of troops in armor, bearing the great red cloaks of Alara. She wondered if they hated her for traveling inside the comfort of the caravan along with the others. But if they hated her, she pondered, surely they wouldn't be here to protect her. No, she surmised, they were proud to march for them. They were proud to suffer on this road if it meant protecting her family. Reya Vandren was one of more than a dozen families making the trip to Portis today. Most were making their way to the city for the Festival of Long Nights, a winter festival that was celebrated annually. If her calculations were correct, they would be there in only a few days and in time for the rising sun. Already more than halfway there. She was 14 now, a young lady, and she was excited to spend time in the courts. Most of all, she was excited to see the house of the ethereal court, the real reason they were on the road. It is said that the ethereal court resided inside the mountain that loomed over the city of Portis. She had heard that the mages lived inside the mountain and bathed in hot springs and spent their afternoons reading books and learning spells. How lovely. Her brother was almost 9 now, and for the past 2 months, he had begun to show the telltale signs of a budding mage. She was a bit jealous, but as long as she got to spend her days in the court, she didn't mind. Her heart was elated at the thought of wearing her best dresses and attending balls, and, "Are we there yet?" Her brother broke the silence. "Kit," she sighed. "I've told you a million times now, this is a long trip." "I know," he huffed. "We have to be getting close, right? The sun's been out for days," he pouted. "Almost, and the first dark is almost here. We have to make it through that, and then we're home," she added simply. Kit turned back to his window and remained silent once more. She watched him curiously, the way his dark hair curled at the ends so wildly. How could someone so young demand so much attention? She had seen him do strange things with his magic, sure, but surely that was normal? Though she hadn't met many mages, and certainly none so young as Kit. "Almost there, young sir," he heard a voice break through. Killian had apparently heard as he passed and slowed his horse to match their wagon. He looked glorious and handsome in his shining armor, The red cloak billowed, and she could see a little snow had gathered on his shoulders and in his hair. His face was flushed, his cheeks and nose red from the cold. "Not far now," he added with a warm smile. "Would you like my mittens?" Reya offered him, running a hand through her golden hair, now wishing she had had a moment to freshen up. "No, my lady," he replied with a slow nod. "Not unless you happen to have some rum or whiskey tucked away in there," he jested. She laughed and blushed. Gods, he was handsome. "No, sorry, Sir Killian," she said a little quieter. One day, she'd be old enough to marry a knight like him. "We'll be there soon." He gave her a final smile, and with a flick of the reins, the horse galloped off ahead, leaving a mist of snow and warm breath in the air. She looked back at her brother, who was still pouting and staring out the window on his side. She remembered when, only a few weeks ago, Kit had fallen into a strange fit of madness in the middle of the night. They had found him hovering outside his window 3 stories from the ground, and below him at least 100 stray cats and dogs had gathered to watch. Not even a week later, they were walking along their lands when a bandit tried to rob them around mid-dark. He had snuck up on them and held Kit at knife point. Their parents had watched horrified when Kit suddenly burst into tears, and seconds later, the bandit slit his own throat. Kit wailed for what felt like hours, covering the man's blood. Reya shivered at the memories. It was easy to forget how powerful Kit was becoming when he acted so normal. So here they were on their way to Portis, to the ethereal court, home of the grandest school of mages in Alara, where he would hopefully learn to control his powers. She wondered which of the paths he would choose, and whether he would serve in the military as a battle mage and become famous like in the old stories when the great mages fought against the demigods. Or perhaps he would live a life in the courts as an advisor to some distant king. She grew sad at the idea of being away from her brother, but so immensely proud of him. The idea thrilled her, but it made her feel so normal in comparison. And here he was, sitting beside her as if nothing had happened, as if they were on some vacation in a far-off land. Instead, they were being accompanied by hundreds of troops and dozens of noble houses on what was probably the coldest winter in a long time. Or at least it felt like it to her. "Do you think they'll like me?" Kit finally asked. Reya peeled her eyes away from the empty seats across from them. She eyed the cushions and the stitching, thinking before she finally spoke. "I think they will be proud to have you, and one day, we might even sit on the council." She smiled at him, bumping him with her shoulder. "They have lots of mages in the court," he retorted. "Perhaps." There was a moment of silence before she locked eyes with him. "But not a Vandren. And none so young as you," she winked. He blushed a little. Just beyond him, the horizon was growing darker. The sun was setting and would not rise again for many days. On top of that, the sky looked as if they were in for more snow tonight. "That's what I'm afraid of." He stared at his lap now. She couldn't imagine what he was feeling. The caravan halted suddenly. "Surely we aren't there yet." Then there came a sudden sound. One that they would never forget. What sounded like thousands of voices crying out from the direction of the mountain. She heard the rushing of metal as hundreds of troops rushed around the caravan, around the carriage they were in. She heard the horns of Alara blaring and horses galloping. She peered outside for a moment to find soldiers shouting, forming lines. Descending down the rocky mountainside were the cloaked figures of innumerable warriors. Blasts of fire and lightning struck the snow in front of them. Soldiers shouted, and in seconds, a battle had erupted around their caravan. In that moment, Killian rushed back to their carriage, his face red and his breathing heavy. "Shut the windows," he said, with wide eyes. "We're under attack." That was the last time that she ever looked on the handsome face of Sir Killian. Chapter 4. For Reine, the Watch, the Ambush. They came across the caravan quickly enough. The Black Company had ridden nonstop to make it to the pass in time. They were in luck, as a heavy snowfall had slowed the Alaran caravan and had given them time to set up camp and rest. The camp was set up just behind Theron, down a small hill hidden from the road. Theron knew his troops were cold and tired, he could feel it. But they were too good at what they did to voice it. They were 56 strong, some of the best of Reine. Yet he could see the bitterness and longing for home in their faces nonetheless. Theron couldn't help but feel proud of his troops and their determination. It filled him with joy to see them so eager to face their enemies. He had seen fear in the faces of his own troops before he ever joined the Black Company, long before he was a soldier of standing in Reine. Theron ran a hand through his graying beard absent-mindedly, as he did every time before a battle. "Still no sign of more mages?" he asked his second-in-command. She stood beside him, shivering, uncomplaining. Her hair was short, and there was a scar on her scalp from when he had stitched her head back up many seasons back now. She shook her head. "Just the one on horseback," she added. "Though he seems formidable. He's no match for all of us," he replied. She nodded again. "Yes, sir." There was a long pause. He turned to look at her, studying her face. "You're oddly quiet," he said simply. She didn't reply. She only stared back with her dark eyes. He had dreamed of those eyes many nights, but as a forgiven, he was not awarded the luxury of taking a wife. Such was his sacrifice in her name. He pushed the thoughts aside. "Come on, Mira, I know you well enough to know when you wish to say something. Speak freely," he said, warming his hands with his breath. "The others," she began, "they wish to go home." She let her words hang. "As do I, Mira," he sighed. "Yes, sir." She leaned on him for a moment as she repositioned, her warmth comforting him for the briefest of moments. "We do this, and we can go home," he offered. "Until when?" "When is the next time they will send us out again?" she replied a little hastily, some bite in her tone. His eyes locked on hers and she quelled, looking down sheepishly. "Sir." Theron sighed deeply. "I know," he added. "I miss my home too." He was silent for a moment. Then he gave her a side glance, locking eyes with her with a small smile. "Tell me about your home, Mira." "I live outside the city walls," she began. "In Farmside?" "No, near Warren," she corrected. "Ah," he added, nodding. His breath created a thick fog in the air as he shivered. "I live alone with my horses." She stared at the sky. "Aaron, my horse master, is probably putting them in right now before the long dark." She smiled weakly. "I have a large stone hearth that I miss more than anything right now." She laughed, looking up, remembering. Theron laughed with her. "I'm sure we could all use a good warm fire right now." "I have a large dining table that has probably been used once," she continued. "You should come by sometime," she said, quieter. "I'm not much of a cook, but I would love to." He bumped her with his shoulder. He could feel the tension growing between them. He turned his gaze on the road. The scouts hadn't returned yet, and it was starting to make him nervous. "I have a cellar that is warm and dry year-round. I keep only the best there," she continued. "I even have a few bottles from some imperial vineyards." "Blasphemy," he added mockingly. He knew that most troops dreamed of tasting the wines of Alara. She laughed her warm, melodious laugh. It was music to him in a world of noise. "We could share a bottle," she said, quieter still. "And we could drink all night." She shifted her weight, stepping just the slightest bit closer. "And eat." He felt her shoulder brush his again. He wanted so badly to put his arm around her. "And we could rise whenever we wanted," she said, leaning in, both of them looking straight ahead. "Now you're speaking fairy tales," he replied as another fog cloud appeared before them. You don't see yourself retiring ever?" "I will retire at the end of a blade, I think. Perhaps in a few hours, if I'm being honest." He looked at her for another moment. Her warm eyes stared back, haunted, wanting to say more. "I see you old and gray by a fire, reading a book." She studied him. "That sounds lovely." "We could have that, Theron," she said softly. "Mira." He sighed, unsure of how to reply. Then there was the unmistakable sound of 2 horses coming up the hill. He saw their figures break through the trees as the last bit of light left the forest. The sky was still light, though not for long. Soon they would be in more than 100 hours of darkness. Mira sighed. They looked at each other for a moment before finally Theron put a hand on her shoulder and nodded. "Get ready," he said quietly. "Yes, sir." She smiled, the light in her eyes dimmed once more. "What news?" he called to the riders as they stepped in front of them. "The caravan is close. Maybe half an hour away," the rider spoke out of breath. "Good. To the camp, get warm and rouse the troops," he sighed deeply. "It's time." The black company poured down the hill like water in a river. Theron was the first to cry out as a ball of fire erupted along the line from their hands. He felt the tingling on his skin as the mages in his company fired on the Alaran lines. His troops roared and crashed on silver shields. The battlefield was now ablaze as arrows flew past. He watched as soldiers on both sides fell quickly, the clang of swords and the cry of battle filling his ears. He turned in time to see a sword coming at him and parried it sloppily. He recovered quickly, stumbling backwards, and with a few swings cut down his opponent, their blood spraying him. Another gout of flame erupted along the line as another mage torched a wagon in the caravan. Theron heard the cries of the nobles inside, their screams drowned out by the battle, but the smell of their flesh permeated along the front. "For Reine!" he heard his troops call out. "For the Great Mother!" another replied. The Alarans were caught completely unawares. Within minutes, the line began to fold, and their silver armor littered the floor. Even though Theron's troops were outnumbered, the element of surprise proved too much. Theron walked over bodies, moving towards the back of the caravan. He saw bodies melted into the earth, their cloaks still on fire. One was blinking, still too far gone to feel the pain, but croaked in agony as he reached up for Theron. Theron drove his blade into his head, putting him out of his misery. In front of him, he watched one of his forgiven troops, on horseback, come to swords with a handsome knight on a horse of his own. The Alaran clearly knew what he was doing, and dispatched not one but 3 of Theron's troops, one after the other, before Theron caught up. "You fight well, but you will die tonight, Imperial," Theron spoke loudly across the field. The man dismounted with a smile. He seemed to relish the challenge. For a brief moment, the Alaran knight turned away, his crimson cloak towards Theron. If it had been any other soldier, the Alaran might have had him. But Theron watched as the soldier whipped around quickly and a blast of lightning arced its way towards him. He felt the sting of its heat for a mere moment, the strange smell in the air before his own hands went up and the lightning broke on his barrier, arcing away and into the trees. "Nice try," Theron called out again, his heart racing. "That was close." "What is your name?" the knight called to Theron. "Why?" Theron replied, the 2 pacing in front of each other as the battle erupted behind them, circling around each other like predators. "I wish to know what to put on your gravestone when I kill you," the knight replied. Theron laughed and spat on the ground. "And believe me, I will kill you," he retorted. "It will be my blade that shuts your eyes forever." "Theron is my name, soldier of Alara, though you do not need to know it." The Alaran knight smirked at him as the sky grew darker. "And what is your name?" "You can't use my joke," he retorted. "I wish to know whose parents I'll be riding home to tonight to explain how their son died bravely for jesting too much," Theron spat out. "My name is Killian Thrum, first knight of the Red Suns, and you chose the wrong battle tonight, Theron, child of Reine." Killian leapt forward with a violent scream. Their swords crashed together violently. The 2 parried, spinning around each other. Theron slung fire at Killian Thrum, and Killian skillfully absorbed it, the flames breaking against him, nothing more than light in the growing darkness. Within those few tense exchanges, the battle continued around them as the Alaran caravan was slowly overcome. Then it was over. Killian stumbled, trying to catch himself a moment too late, and with one swift kick, Theron threw him off the road and into the canyon abyss. He watched at the edge of the battle as Killian tumbled into the darkness of the trees far below. Chapter 5. Run, run, run. Reya held her brother's hand firmly as they dashed through the battle and into the dark. She could hear him crying, but she had to focus. Now was not the time to be afraid, even though she was. She couldn't be the scared child right now. No, she had to be the brave older sister. She pulled them through the chaos, whipping past the caravan, past the shrubs, and to the edge of the canyon. She didn't have a chance to think. She jumped with barely a glance. Her feet found a ledge. She turned and helped Kit down as she heard the shouts from the Reinian soldiers. "Come on," she whispered. "Hurry," she cooed. Another ledge. And another. "But Mother and Father," he cried, leaping down to another ledge. "Don't worry," she said, taking his face in her hands. "They will be okay. You hear me? They will." But Reya could see the fear in his eyes. He could probably see the fear in hers that betrayed her words. "Come on," she said, steeling herself, not giving him a chance to think. They never made it to the next ledge, however. One of the stones gave way, and they tumbled down the cliffside and landed about 10 feet down on their backs. Reya stood, forcing Kit back to his feet. "Are you okay?" she asked, panting. He nodded, and a split second later an arrow struck the ground near them. "Let's go!" She climbed over the ledge, finding the next one, and the next ledge, and the next, until finally they were at least 300 feet below the flames far above them as arrows struck the ground wildly. But she knew they couldn't see. They were firing into the dark, night-blind from the fires. She pressed her back to the canyon wall for only a moment and looked at her brother, who was hyperventilating, his eyes wide with fear. She grew suddenly afraid, knowing what happened whenever he felt fear like this. She saw some of her hairs begin to stand on end, and small sparks were coming off of Kit's body. She grabbed him by the face again, making him look up at her. "We can't stop now," she whispered to him. "We need to keep running. Understood?" He didn't respond. His eyes were searching, scanning, looking for a direction to flee. "Kit," she barked in a hoarse whisper, "if we don't move, they will kill us. If we don't stick together, they will kill us. We need to be brave, like Father. Got it?" She searched his gaze, seeing the tears welling up. "Kit!" Finally he nodded, holding back a sob with a deep breath. "Good. Run!" She grabbed his hand and took off into the darkness. The trees whipped at them and snow dug into their skin. The last light was fading now. To the children it felt like a curse, but in the darkness they would be able to run farther unseen. For now. They ran for what felt like hours. They tumbled down cliff walls, trying to make it to the base of the mountain, back to somewhere familiar. But they were met with ravine after ravine, and walls of trees like spikes holding them back. They were trapped. Her parents had left the carriage hours ago to mingle with the other nobles, and in the back of her mind all Reya could think about was if they had gotten away. Had she lied to her brother when she told him they were fine? Of course not, she thought to herself. They had to be alive. They had to be. They were probably running just like her, lost just like her. Any moment now they would run into them and they'd all be safe. Together. Theron cursed himself for his carelessness as Mira pulled the crossbow bolt out of his shoulder. He winced and let out a breathy grunt as she tossed it onto the ground. "You should have known better," Mira scolded him. He spat some blood out, a fog filling the air as he did. His troops were huddled around the few fires scattered across the road. The fight was over. The mission was complete. But Theron couldn't get the images he saw out of his mind. He had expected warriors. He had expected a fight with equals. He'd expected evil. But what he got was children. He couldn't get their faces out of his mind. Mira knelt in front of him, trying to catch his gaze in hers, but he was lost in thoughts. "What's wrong?" she asked him under her breath. The kid, But he couldn't finish his thoughts. He put his head in his hands, pressing his fingers to his temples. "They ran into the storm. They'll die out there. It's done," she offered. He nodded his head, but his heart was screaming at him. He would have done anything for the Queen. Anything. But he felt as if he had just peeled back a curtain that had been holding back a void. He had been told that the mages were raised as warriors from a young age, that they were formidable and fearless and stood against everything that the kingdom of Reine stood for. They were tyrants and demons. But what he saw were children. that were no different than if he had had them himself. He could still see their smiles. He could still hear their screams. They lied to me. He felt a pain beyond the physical. Was he on the wrong side of the fight? Doubt crept into the corners of his soul. A cold sweat was developing on his forehead. He stood now, pushing aside the soldiers that were tending to him. "I'm fine," he barked. "Gather supplies, tend to the wounded. We move out in a few hours." He began to walk to the edge of the road as Mira stared at him curiously. After all these years, she could sense something was wrong. "What are you doing?" she asked quietly. "I can see that you're thinking." "I'm looking for them." He scanned the darkness far below him, his eyes squinting, grasping. "The kids?" she asked with a sigh. She spun in place, rubbing her eyes in frustration, but she knew she had to keep her voice down. "Theron, they're dead. If they didn't die tumbling down the cliffside, they'll die from the cold, or the wolves will get them. Leave them, Theron. It's over." She put her hand on his shoulder. "Theron. Theron, please. It's over." Theron turned to look at her. There was a sadness there that she had never seen. She opened her mouth to speak, but lost the words staring at him. She had seen Theron the soldier, Theron the forgiven, Theron the man. But she had never seen Theron the boy. And here he was looking back at her, lost like a child searching for answers. "I have to finish this." He locked eyes with her, grabbing her by both arms. He could feel the muscle underneath her tunic and thought momentarily about the years they spent training. He saw all of the years of their friendship laid out before him, and he winced. If he had known what he knew now before becoming a soldier, would their lives have turned out differently? Would they be together had they grown up in Alara? They could have had a home together, a life. But he knew what he had to do. "Theron, the troops. We just want to go home. Please." But Theron ignored her. Tears were welling up in his eyes now, and the sight of them silenced Mira. She had never seen him like this. She just stared at him, speechless. There was so much he wanted to say. He wanted to forsake everything. He wanted to lean in and kiss her. But he stopped himself. "I leave you in charge," he finished, and began the climb down. The whole way down, he could hear the children's names being screamed in his head. What had that kid done to him? Was it a ruse, some dark magic? Or was it simply his first glimpse at the truth? It was now fully dark. The sun was now below the horizon and would not rise again for many days. This was the worst-case scenario for Reya and her brother, and Reya knew that. But she wouldn't tell Kit. She couldn't. Kit hadn't spoken in almost an hour. They were just trudging through the snow quietly. "Don't worry about Mom and Dad. They'll find us," she said aloud finally. "Mm-hmm," Kit responded, staring at each foot as it disappeared in the snow. "They will," she repeated. But she wasn't sure if that was meant for him or for herself. She could feel the anxiety and fear creeping back in. She could still smell the smoke on her furs, the smell of flesh and blood in the air. She could hear the screams and see the blood running like streams over the snow, crimson puddles. She shut her eyes firmly, trying to push the images out of her mind, but they were burned into her eyelids. Tears streamed down her face now, and she wiped at them quickly, her breath fogging up the air. She heard a snap behind her, as if someone stepping on a twig or pushing through branches. "Mom? Dad?" she asked quietly, unconfidently. There was only silence. Their breath hung in the air. Then finally a figure stepped out from the shadows. A figure in armor. "Sir Killian?" she asked again. Then the figure drew their sword. "I found you, you little shits." An unfamiliar voice broke the silence. She saw his eyes first, glowing green, reflecting a ghost light in them. He was enchanted, she could tell, to see in the dark. Reya screamed, putting herself between the stranger and her brother. "Please," she began. The soldier spat at her, blood staining the snow in front of her now. "Your lies won't get to me," he interrupted. "Your words are a veil, but I serve the Queen and the Great Mother, and they will protect me tonight." He drew a dagger with his other hand. He stepped forward into what little light there was out here, his face contorted with rage. He was balding and thin, of small stature with a hooked nose. "Please," she begged again, softly now, tears running down her cheeks again. "Yeah, go on," he egged her on, his laughter filling the air. "Beg. Cry. Your people killed dozens of my men today." He stepped forward. The kids stepped back. Reya sobbed now. It was over. They were gonna die here, in the middle of nowhere, so close to their destination. She would never get to live a life in the courts. She would never see her brother become a famous warrior. She would never see her parents again. She stared up at the sky for one last time. She looked at Altyrion, the great emerald sphere in the sky in all its beauty, swirls of red on a sea of green. She closed her eyes and squeezed her brother's hand. Then, the blade found its mark. She heard the grunt and felt the spray of blood. But it wasn't hers. She looked at her brother to see if he was okay, who was staring in shock. She followed his gaze and saw a blade in the throat of the assailant. His eyes were wide in shock. And with a sickening suction sound, the blade pulled back and his body crumpled to the ground, falling into the soft snow. Standing there in front of them was Theron. He was panting with tears streaked through a soot-stained face. The children didn't move. They just stared at him in shock. The dying soldier clutched at Theron, gurgling, drowning. Theron stared into the man's eyes with sorrow, and the man looked back with confusion and fear. He held the man's hand until he died. Then Theron rose and stood in front of them, now a great figure in armor, the silhouette of death in this forest. The enemy. Then what happened next, they didn't expect. "Run," he whispered to them. "Run," he ordered again. The children took a few steps back, confused. "Run! Come on!" And together, the three of them ran off into the snowy dark.